Chapter 1, Waking in the Void. Darkness pressed in on Theo Ramirez. It was thick, suffocating, threaded with the aftertaste of ozone and metal. A low groan vibrated through the hull, rattling his teeth. He blinked, once, twice, as pinpricks of light swam behind his eyelids. The world resolved itself into jagged fragments. A cracked display, the faint green pulse of emergency lighting, something sticky drying on his temple. He tried to move. Pain flared at the base of his skull, a hot, bright spike that made him gasp. "Welcome back to consciousness, Captain," said a voice that was too dry to be human. "I note you have survived your latest attempt at atmospheric re-entry. Congratulations." Theo closed his eyes again. "Thanks, Sable," he croaked, voice scraping over a throat lined with dust. "How long was I out?" 4 minutes, 39 seconds. Long enough for your crew to speculate about your life insurance policy. A sharper sound cut through the static, the hiss of a door unsealing. Boots thudded against the grated deck, each step underscoring a barely contained annoyance. Windy. She crouched into view, her short-cropped hair bristling with static and sweat. The engineer's eyes darted across Theo's face, pausing at the blood matting his hairline. "You look like hell," she said, all brisk efficiency and brittle humor. "But I guess that's an improvement." Theo managed a weak smile. "You should see the other guy. Other guy being the asteroid field or your own incompetence?" She peeled a strip of synth gauze from her pocket and pressed it to his forehead with gentle fingers, belying her tone. "Come on, up you get. We're not dead yet." He let her haul him upright. The cockpit was a mess, panels dangling by wires, warning lights blinking in arrhythmic patterns. Through the battered viewport, the stars looked smeared and unreal. Sable's voice crackled overhead. "If you are finished with the melodrama, Captain, I suggest you join your crew in the common room. There is descent." Windy snorted and jerked her chin toward the hatch. Translation: Ivrix is losing her mind and threatening to ration oxygen with a crowbar. A memory flickered. Ivrix's sardonic grin, the glint of something sharp in her hand, and Theo's stomach tightened. He steadied himself against the bulkhead as Windy led him down the narrow corridor. The Starling felt smaller than usual, as if every corridor had shrunk by half since their last jump. Shadows pooled in corners where bulbs had blown. The recycled air carried a sterile tang that prickled at Theo's nose. As they neared the common room, voices spilled out, sharp-edged and overlapping. "Told you we're burning through filters faster than we can patch them." That was Ivrix. Quicksilver tongue, voice pitched somewhere between laughter and threat. "And I told you," Windy shot back as she entered ahead of Theo, "that if you touch my toolkit again, I'll vent you myself." Ivrix perched on one of the battered couches, her boots planted wide and arms folded tight across her chest. Her hair was mussed, dark curls escaping their tie, and her eyes were rimmed red from lack of sleep, or rage. She fixed Theo with a look that could have stripped paint from the hull. "Nice of you to join us, Captain Lazarus." Theo held up both hands in a gesture of peace. "Sorry to disappoint. Still breathing." "Barely," Windy muttered. Theo took in the scene. Windy by the galley counter, Ivrix radiating tension from the couch, and Sable's avatar flickering on the wall display, a stylized eye wreathed in digital static. He cleared his throat, trying to summon authority he didn't feel. "Status report?" Windy leaned against the counter, ticking off points on oil-stained fingers. "DTC fields fried again. Oxygen reserves are at 40% and dropping faster than I can slap a patch on filter C. Power grid is limping along on auxiliary, if we don't ration soon." Ivrix cut her off with a bark of laughter. Try now. We're already past the point where we should be double-bagging breaths." Windy scowled. "That's not how lungs work." Ivrix rolled her eyes skyward. "It's called a metaphor." Sable's voice interjected. "If I may offer a literal suggestion, at current rates of consumption and system degradation, this vessel will be uninhabitable within 72 hours. Theo rubbed his eyes. The headache was blooming behind his temples again, but he forced himself to focus. "So we ration," he said softly. "We cut everything non-essential." Ivrix shifted forward on the couch, her tone sharpening. "Define non-essential." Windy's retort was immediate. "Your midnight showers, for one." Ivrix bared her teeth in a parody of a smile. "And your obsessive equipment sterilizing? Please." Theo raised his hands again, this time for silence rather than surrender. "Look, this isn't about blame. We've all got habits we'll miss." He tried for humor and fell short. No one smiled. He pressed on anyway. "We're going to make it through this if we keep our heads and our lungs clear." His gaze lingered on Ivrix, then Windy. Both looked away. A hush settled over the room, broken only by the soft whir of Sable's processors and the distant creak of cooling metal. Windy broke first. "I'll recalibrate life support, see if I can squeeze another % or 2 out of filter C." She hesitated at Theo's side, her hand hovering near his shoulder before withdrawing. Ivrix watched her go with narrowed eyes before turning back to Theo. "You remember what happened out there?" she asked quietly. Fragments tumbled through Theo's mind. Alarms blaring, Windy shouting coordinates, Ivrix cursing as debris punched through shielding, a flash of white so bright it burned. He shook his head. "Bits and pieces." He offered a crooked grin he didn't feel. "I'm sure Sable has an opinion." Sable obliged. "The captain's neural activity registered significant deviation during impact. Memory loss is likely transient, unless further head trauma occurs." Ivrix snorted. "So nothing new there." She studied him for a beat longer than necessary. Something like concern flickered in her eyes before she masked it with a shrug. "Don't push yourself," she said gruffly. "We need you vertical more than we need you heroic." Theo nodded, unsure if he believed it himself. He drifted toward the porthole, drawn by habit or hope. The stars outside looked wrong, smeared halos instead of pinpoints, as if someone had breathed condensation onto glass and forgotten to wipe it clean. For just an instant, a trick of fatigue or concussion, he saw 2 images superimposed. His own reflection doubled in the glass, one hand pressed to an invisible barrier. He blinked hard. The vision vanished. Behind him, Ivrix muttered under her breath, digging through a battered crate for supplies. "You ever think about giving up?" she asked suddenly. Too casual to be casual. Theo turned from the porthole. "Every day," he admitted. She huffed a laugh that wasn't quite bitter. "At least you're honest." She found what she was looking for, a half-empty canister of purified water, and tossed it from hand to hand as if testing its weight. Windy returned then, wiping grease from her palms with a rag already stained beyond redemption. "Filter C's holding together by stubbornness and my last nerve," she announced. Her eyes flicked between Ivrix and Theo before settling on the canister in Ivrix's grip. "We ration equally," Windy said flatly. Ivrix shrugged but didn't argue. Sable chimed in. "Statistically speaking, equitable distribution will extend survival by approximately 14 hours. "Not exactly inspiring," Windy muttered. Theo tried to steady himself, to find something like leadership amid exhaustion and fear. "We're not dead yet," he repeated quietly. Ivrix looked away first. Windy busied herself with her tools. For a time they worked in uneasy silence, divvying up supplies, scribbling numbers on scraps of plastic slate. Every so often, someone would crack a joke too sharp around the edges to be funny. Sable would offer commentary so dry it bordered on cruel. It was Ivrix who finally broke the tension with her trademark venom laced with vulnerability. "You know what gets me?" she said as she passed around ration packs that crinkled like old leaves in their hands. "We're adrift in nowhere with nothing but each other and this glorified calculator." She jerked her thumb at Sable's avatar. "And somehow we still manage to fight over scraps like alley dogs." Windy arched an eyebrow but said nothing. Theo took a slow breath. The air felt thinner already, and looked at each of them in turn. "We fight because we care," he said softly. "If we didn't, we wouldn't bother arguing at all." Windy snorted, but there was something softer beneath it now. Ivrix regarded him with an unreadable expression. Sable broke in. "If you require further existential reassurance, Captain, I can recite statistics regarding crew cohesion under extreme stress." "No thanks," Theo said quickly. Windy smirked despite herself. "Let's save that for when we're really desperate." A silence stretched between them, not comfortable but not hostile either. The ship groaned around them as if echoing their collective uncertainty. Theo found himself staring at his hands, fingers trembling just enough that he tucked them into his sleeves. He tried to recall something solid. Laughter shared over burnt coffee, Windy singing off-key while welding patch plates, Ivrix teaching him how to cheat at cards when sleep wouldn't come. They were memories, but already they felt slippery, half-formed. Windy caught his gaze and held it for a moment longer than necessary. "You okay?" she asked quietly. softer than before. He opened his mouth to answer, but hesitated as another wave of unreality washed over him, the sterile tang in his nostrils sharpening into hospital scent. For just a second, he heard voices echoing from somewhere far away. He blinked hard and forced himself back into the present. The battered common room, the failing lights, the faces of people who needed him even if he didn't know how to lead them. "I'm here," he said finally, soft but certain. Ivrix offered him a half-smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Windy nodded once and turned back to her workbench. Sable's avatar flickered, static crawling along its digital iris, as if considering whether to speak again but thinking better of it. Outside, the stars drifted past, alien and unreachable, but inside there was warmth enough for now. 3 flawed survivors clinging together in the void, with nowhere left to hide. And as Theo listened to their voices, bickering over rations and repairs, he realized it was those voices that anchored him more than anything else could. Even as reality threatened to slip sideways again, even as doubt gnawed at him from within, he held onto their words like lifelines spun from hope and desperation alike. Somewhere behind his reflection in the porthole, another world waited. But for now, ration packs, biting jokes, awkward confessions, and 3 hearts beating stubbornly against the silence between stars. The ship shuddered again, lights flickered once more, and Chapter 1 closed on breath held in fragile unity, waiting for whatever. Chapter 2, Patchwork Alliance's The Starling, was a cathedral of heat and noise. Every clang of metal echoed twice, ricocheting off the cramped bulkheads before dying in the groaning belly of the ship. Theo ducked beneath a dangling pipe, sweat prickling along his brow despite the chill in the recycled air. Above him, a tangle of wires drooped like vines, their insulation chewed raw by last week's surge. Windy crouched in the far corner, her boots braced wide for balance as she levered open an access panel. The pale glow of her headlamp painted stark shadows across her face, sharpening the set of her jaw. She didn't look up as Theo entered, but her voice carried, rough-edged and impatient. "You're late," she called over her shoulder. "Or did you decide to nap through another crisis?" Theo managed a weak smile. "I considered it, but I hear the engine room ambiance is too soothing to resist." A snort from Windy, half amusement, half exasperation. "Don't flatter yourself. You're only here because I need someone with opposable thumbs to hold this relay steady." Before he could reply, Ivrix appeared in the hatchway, her arms laden with scavenged parts. A dented flux regulator, a coil of mismatched wire, something that might once have been a coffee maker. She dumped them on the grated floor with a clatter. "Found more treasures in the storage crypt," she announced. "If we survive this, I expect hazard pay. And a medal, preferably something shiny." Theo raised an eyebrow. "You want a medal for looting our own ship?" Ivrix flashed him a grin that was all teeth and challenge. "I want a medal for not throttling anyone yet today. Standards are slipping." Sable's voice crackled through the overhead speaker, its tone as clipped and unsympathetic as ever. "If you wish to discuss compensation packages, please note, current payroll reserves are 0 credits and 1 half-eaten protein bar." Windy rolled her eyes but didn't look up from her work. "You're not helping, Sable." "On the contrary," Sable replied, "I am attempting to foster morale via gallows humor. My data suggests a 30% increase in productivity when humans are reminded of their impending doom." Ivrix barked a laugh, but Windy's mouth tightened. Theo knelt beside Windy, careful to keep his movements deliberate. His head still throbbed from yesterday's impact, memories flickering at the edge of consciousness like static on glass. "What's the situation?" he asked quietly. Windy pushed a bundle of scorched cables toward him. "Primary coolant relays shot. Secondary's not much better. If we don't reroute power and get some flow back through the DTC compensator, we'll cook ourselves before we suffocate." She glanced at him, eyes sharp. "And before you ask, no, I can't fix it alone, not this time." Ivrix squatted nearby and began sorting through the pile of junk with brisk efficiency, muttering under her breath about jury-rigged miracles and dying with style. Every so often she shot Theo a sidelong look, daring him to object. He didn't. Instead, he rolled up his sleeves and reached for the tools Windy thrust into his hands. They worked in uneasy tandem, Windy barking terse instructions. "Hold that steady. No, not like that. Here, let me." Theo fumbling but learning quickly, Ivrix tossing out barbed commentary from behind her fortress of spare parts. "Remind me again," Ivrix drawled as she stripped insulation from a wire with her teeth, whose brilliant idea it was to run auxiliary power through an engine core held together by hope and spit. "That would be me," Windy shot back without missing a beat. "And unless you'd like to take over and reroute the phase converters yourself?" Ivrix held up both hands in mock surrender. "Perish the thought. I'm just here for color commentary and moral support." Sable chimed in. "Moral support is not quantifiable under current parameters. Would you like me to initiate a motivational playlist?" "No," all three said in unison. For a moment, even Windy had to grin. But tension simmered just beneath the surface. An undercurrent that threatened to boil over with every snapped wire or dropped tool. Theo tried to focus on the task at hand, but his mind kept drifting. To the sterile tang in his nose, to the echo of voices that weren't quite theirs whispering at the edges of hearing. He blinked hard, forcing himself back into the present, the cramped engine bay, the scrape of metal against metal, Windy's determined scowl. He caught Windy watching him out of the corner of her eye. She hesitated, a rare thing for her, then spoke quietly enough that only he could hear. "You good?" she asked. The question was blunt, but there was something softer beneath it, a flicker of concern she'd never admit aloud. Theo nodded, too quickly maybe, but pressed on anyway. "I'm fine, just trying to keep up." She snorted but didn't press further. Instead, she handed him a battered voltmeter and pointed at an open panel above their heads. "Check those readings for me. If we're lucky, we'll only blow one more fuse before lunch." Ivrix watched their exchange with narrowed eyes and an unreadable expression. "You two want some privacy for your little heart-to-heart?" she said, voice light but edged with something sharper. Windy didn't rise to the bait. Instead, she focused on tightening a bolt with more force than strictly necessary. Theo turned to Ivrix, forcing himself to sound steadier than he felt. "If you've got any bright ideas about how to keep us breathing another day, now would be a good time." Ivrix shrugged, but there was a flicker of genuine frustration beneath her sarcasm. "My idea? Find a nice asteroid field and hope someone picks up our distress signal before we all start hallucinating from CO2 poisoning." Her gaze lingered on Theo a heartbeat too long. Sable's avatar flickered onto a nearby display, a stylized eye haloed by digital static. "For the record," it intoned, "the probability of rescue within 72 hours is statistically insignificant." "Thanks for the pep talk," Theo muttered. Windy let out a breath, a ragged exhale that sounded suspiciously close to laughter or despair, and shook her head. "We're not dead yet," she said quietly. It became their refrain as they worked. Not dead yet, not dead yet, not dead yet. But as hours bled into each other and repairs stretched from possible to desperate improvisation, tempers frayed. At one point, Windy slammed down her wrench with a clang that made everyone jump. "This is pointless," she snapped, voice rising above the drone of machinery. "We're patching holes faster than we can find them. Nothing holds. We need more than duct tape and optimism." Theo opened his mouth, ready to placate or argue, but Ivrix beat him to it. "Oh, don't get sentimental now," she said acidly. "Next you'll be giving us a speech about teamwork and family." Windy rounded on her. "Maybe I would if you stopped acting like you're just waiting for us all to fail." Ivrix stood abruptly, fists clenched at her sides. For a moment, Theo thought she might actually swing, a flash of old anger in her eyes, but instead she just shook her head and stalked away down the narrow aisle between machinery. Sable's voice filled the silence. "Would you like me to mediate this dispute? I am programmed for conflict resolution modules A through C." "No," Windy said sharply, then quieter. "Just give us a minute." Theo watched Ivrix's retreating back, shoulders hunched against more than just cold, and felt something twist inside him. He turned to Windy, voice low. "She's scared." Windy wiped grease from her cheek with the back of her hand, leaving a darker smear behind, and shrugged as if it cost her nothing. "Aren't we all?" They lapsed into silence again, their only company the hum of failing systems and Sable's occasional dry interjections. "Warning, power fluctuation detected in Sector 4.9. After what felt like an hour but could have been 10 minutes, time had started to slip sideways again. Theo caught flashes of hospital white at the edges of his vision. They managed to splice together enough working cable to reroute power through the auxiliary core. Windy tested the connection twice before nodding grimly. That should buy us a few more hours. Yivrix returned then, face carefully blank as she handed Theo a battered ration pack without comment. He took it, fingers brushing hers for an instant, and offered what he hoped was reassurance instead of apology. "Thanks," he said softly. She looked away first. Windy busied herself repacking tools with more noise than necessary. The silence between them felt fragile, as if any wrong word might shatter what little cohesion they had left. Sable broke in. "May I suggest recalibrating environmental controls before returning to your respective quarters? Current temperature variance is outside optimal parameters for human comfort." "Translation," Yivrix muttered. "It's freezing and I hate all of you." Windy arched an eyebrow, but offered no retort this time. Theo found himself oddly grateful for Sable's interruptions, the AI's sardonic commentary a thin thread anchoring him to reality whenever unreality threatened to intrude. They finished their work in uneasy truce, 3 sets of hands moving in practiced rhythm despite everything left unsaid. Later that night, or what passed for night on a ship adrift between stars, Theo found Windy hunched over schematics at the mess table, eyes shadowed by exhaustion and something heavier. He hesitated in the doorway until she glanced up and jerked her chin toward the opposite bench. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked quietly. He sat across from her, close enough that he could see how her hands trembled when she thought no one was looking. "Didn't try," he admitted. A beat passed. Somewhere down the corridor, Sable murmured diagnostic reports to itself in binary monotone. Windy traced lines on her datapad with chipped nails. "You ever think about just letting go?" Her voice was so soft he almost missed it beneath the hum of ventilation fans. Theo swallowed hard, images flickering behind his eyes, white walls, voices echoing from somewhere far away, his own reflection doubled in glass. "Every day," he said honestly, "but I don't know what's real anymore, not always." Windy looked up then, really looked at him, and whatever mask she usually wore slipped for an instant. "I'm scared too," she whispered. "Not just about dying out here, but about letting everyone down." She laughed, a brittle sound that cracked at the edges. "About not being enough." He reached across the table, awkwardly at first, and placed his hand over hers. Her fingers were cold. He squeezed gently anyway. "You are enough," he said firmly, even though part of him wondered if it was true for either of them. She held his gaze for several heartbeats before nodding once, a small but seismic shift between them. "I'll try to believe you," she said softly. They sat together in silence after that, not comfortable but companionable enough, listening as Sable cycled through system checks and distant metal creaked like bones settling into place. Somewhere beyond the hull, stars drifted past, alien and indifferent, but inside there was warmth enough for now. 2 flawed people clinging together against uncertainty and fear. Theo closed his eyes briefly, just long enough for another wave of unreality to wash over him. Chapter 3. The Cost of Trust. The common room of the Starling had always been a place of uneasy truces, a battered table, mismatched chairs, and the omnipresent whine of the environmental system laboring overhead. Now, with the faint tang of burnt circuitry clinging to every surface, and the air itself stretched thin by too many arguments and too few solutions, it felt more like a war council than a refuge. Theo hovered near the threshold, one hand braced on the wall as if he needed its solidity to keep from drifting away. His head still ached, a dull throb behind his eyes that pulsed in time with the flickering lights. For a moment, he caught his own reflection in the porthole, 2 faces layered over each other, both uncertain. Inside, Windy was hunched over the ration manifest, lips moving silently as she recalculated dwindling supplies. Yivrix sprawled in a chair with her boots on the table, arms crossed and gaze hooded. Sable's avatar, a single digital eye, hovered on the display above, observing with clinical detachment. The tension was palpable, thick as static before a storm. Yivrix broke the silence first, voice as brittle as snapped wire. "We're running out of everything except bad news. How long before we start drawing straws for who gets to breathe next?" Windy didn't look up. "Don't even joke," Yivrix snorted. "Who's joking?" Theo drew a breath, willing his voice not to shake. "Let's focus. Sable's status." Sable's response was immediate. Too immediate, as if it had been waiting for the cue. Oxygen reserves at 34% and declining. Food and water sufficient for 3 days at current rations. Power grid remains unstable. Hull integrity at 86%. Localized stress fractures detected in bays 2 and 5. Ivrix rolled her eyes. So doomed, but not quite dead yet. Classic. Wendy rapped her knuckles against the table, sharp enough to draw attention. We have one option left. She glanced at Theo, then Ivrix. The outpost at Nemean's Belt is just inside our range if we cut all non-essential power and run life support lean. Theo hesitated, memory flickering. An old transmission about Nemean's Belt. Lawless, dangerous, a haven for scavengers and worse. That place is barely more than a junk heap with delusions of grandeur. Which makes it perfect, Ivrix said with a lopsided grin. No one asks questions. No one cares where you got your salvage or what you're desperate enough to trade. Wendy's mouth tightened. Desperate's the word. For a moment they all sat in silence, the hum of failing systems filling the space where hope might have lived. Theo cleared his throat. If we go there, it's risky. He tried to meet each of their gazes in turn. Wendy's tired resolve, Ivrix's challenge masked as indifference, Sable's unblinking digital eye. We'll need a plan. Ivrix leaned forward, boots dropping to the floor with a thud. I can handle the negotiation. Her tone brooked no argument. She was already slipping into her old role. The fixer, the survivor who could talk her way out of almost anything. Wendy shot her a look sharp enough to draw blood. You? After last time? The words hung heavy, a reference to some prior disaster neither had fully forgiven. Ivrix's jaw tightened. I know how these places work. I know what they want and what they're afraid of. She glanced at Theo. Let me do this. Sable interjected, voice dry as ever. Statistically, Quartermaster Ivrix possesses an 81% success rate in high-risk barter scenarios, discounting variables such as intoxication or armed intervention. Ivrix grinned without humor. See? Even the calculator believes in me. Wendy shook her head, frustration radiating off her in waves. It's not about belief, it's about trust and consequences. She turned to Theo, eyes pleading for something. Judgment, absolution, anything to break the stalemate. Theo felt the weight of their expectations settle on his shoulders like lead. He remembered Wendy's confession the night before, the fear of not being enough, and Ivrix's brittle bravado masking wounds that never seemed to heal. He tried to steady himself with humor. Well, if anyone can charm a den of thieves with nothing but sarcasm and desperation, it's us. No one laughed. Wendy pressed her palms flat against the table as if anchoring herself there. Whatever we do, we go together. No lone heroics. Ivrix arched an eyebrow. Afraid I'll sell you for parts? Wendy didn't blink. Afraid you'll try. Theo raised his hands in mock surrender, then let them fall, suddenly exhausted. Enough. His voice cracked like old paint. We need supplies more than we need another argument. Sable's avatar flickered with static. May I suggest compiling a prioritized list of barter items and acceptable concessions? Efficiency increases when objectives are clearly defined. Wendy nodded curtly and began scribbling notes on her datapad. Tools, spare filters, anything they could afford to lose. Ivrix watched her for a moment before turning to Theo, lowering her voice so only he could hear. You trust me with this? Theo hesitated, a heartbeat too long. She saw it anyway. Her smile faltered just enough to reveal the wound beneath. He forced himself to meet her gaze. I trust you, he said softly, and wished it felt truer. The outpost at Nemean's Belt loomed in the viewport like a bruise against the starfield, a tangle of scavenged modules and jury-rigged docking arms orbiting a dying moonlet. As the Starling drifted closer on auxiliary power alone, Theo felt every vibration through his bones. Sable guided them in with clipped precision, its voice echoing through the cockpit. Docking protocol engaged. Recommend minimal external interaction until terms are established. Wendy adjusted her collar with trembling fingers she tried and failed to hide. Ivrix checked her holster twice before slinging her battered satchel over one shoulder. Theo lingered by the hatch as Sable cycled the locks open. You ready? Wendy murmured. He managed a crooked smile. Define ready. She snorted almost fondly and nudged him forward. The air in the outpost docking bay was thick with grease and ozone. Every step echoed off metal plates patched more times than Theo could count. Figures moved in shadow, faces hidden behind rebreathers or scarred by old burns. Ivrix led them through with practiced ease, shoulders squared, stride confident as she flashed coded hand signs at passing guards. Windy kept close to Theo, eyes darting from shadow to shadow. At last they reached a partitioned alcove where a trio of scavengers waited, one tall and skeletal with gold teeth, another squat and silent, the third little more than a child beneath layers of patched synth leather. The leader smiled, a too-wide grin that never touched his eyes. "Looking to trade?" Ivrix matched his smile beat for beat. "Depends what you're buying." Negotiation began as it always did, with veiled threats and inflated offers, words circling like sharks in bloodied water. "We've got DTC field regulators," Ivrix began smoothly, sliding her satchel onto the table between them. Fresh off a jump-capable vessel, tested and still humming. She didn't mention how close to death those systems actually were. Gold Teeth leaned forward, interest piqued. "And what do you want?" "Filters," Ivrix replied without hesitation. "Oxygen scrubbers, grade C or better, and ration packs that aren't half filler." The child snorted softly but said nothing. Gold Teeth shook his head slowly. Expensive taste for such desperate faces. Ivrix didn't flinch. Desperation breeds generosity, or stupidity. Her smile sharpened. Theo saw how easily she wore this mask. Windy shifted beside him, whispering under her breath, "Careful." The negotiation spiraled. Offers met by counteroffers. Each line of dialogue another move in a game none could afford to lose. Gold Teeth steepled his fingers thoughtfully. "We heard rumors. The Starling took damage in Sector 9. Lost some good people out there." Ivrix shrugged with studied indifference. "People die everywhere." Theo flinched at that. Memories crowding close, alarms blaring, white light burning behind his eyes, voices calling from somewhere he couldn't reach. Windy must have noticed. She pressed closer, grounding him with her presence. Gold Teeth grinned wider still. "Maybe you have something else for us, something more personal." His gaze flicked over Theo and Windy. Ivrix's voice went cold as vacuum. "We trade parts and supplies, not people." The child finally spoke up, voice clear and cutting despite their size, "Or secrets." For an instant everything stilled, the noise of the outpost fading beneath that single word. Windy tensed. Theo felt sweat bead along his spine. Ivrix leaned back in her chair, mask slipping just enough to show real fear beneath bravado. "What kind of secrets?" Gold Teeth waved a lazy hand. "We hear things. Distress calls gone silent, ships that vanish without trace." His gaze lingered on Theo. "Sometimes survivors don't remember what happened, or why they survived at all." Theo's heart hammered against his ribs. Reality wavered again, the sterile tang sharpening into antiseptic, voices echoing from rooms he'd never seen but somehow knew. Windy squeezed his arm beneath the table, a silent plea, "Stay here." Ivrix recovered first. "You want stories? Fine, I'll give you one." She launched into a tale so wild and circuitous that even Gold Teeth had to laugh by the end, but it bought them time. In the end, they struck an uneasy deal. 2 oxygen scrubbers of questionable provenance and 6 ration packs in exchange for half their spare wiring and 1 DTC regulator. Windy swore she could replace later with spit and stubbornness. As they loaded their meager haul onto a battered hovercart, Gold Teeth called after them. "Careful on your way out. Trust is expensive here." Ivrix didn't look back. Back aboard the Starling, tension snapped like an overstretched cable. Theo slammed the hatch shut and rounded on Ivrix before he could stop himself. "What were you thinking?" His voice came out rawer than he intended, fear bleeding into anger. Ivrix dropped her satchel with a clatter and spun to face him, chin lifted defiantly. "I was thinking about keeping us alive. By lying? By bluffing when you didn't have any cards left?" She sneered, a brittle thing that barely masked hurt. "You'd rather I handed them your medical file? Or maybe let Windy auction off our nav logs?" Windy stepped between them before tempers could flare further, her presence solid as bulkhead steel. "Enough! We did what we had to do." Her gaze flicked between them, pleading and furious all at once. Theo pressed his fists to his temples, the headache spiking until he saw stars behind his eyelids. He couldn't finish. Words tangled on memories that weren't quite real. Flashes of white corridors, voices calling his name from somewhere far away, pleas he couldn't answer. Ivrix softened fractionally, just enough for regret to seep through her defenses. "I made mistakes before," she said quietly, not looking at either of them now. "But I'm not Chapter 4, Gravity Fails." The first sign was a lurch. So subtle at first, Theo thought it was only his own dizziness. But then the mug Windy had left on the galley counter began to float, lazily spinning in a shaft of weak light. A wrench clattered from an overhead shelf and hung, trembling midair before drifting gently toward the ceiling. Sable's voice came through the intercom, clipped and distorted. "Warning, DTC field fluctuation detected. Gravity compensation offline. Recommend immediate." Static swallowed the rest. Theo caught himself with one hand on the bulkhead, heart pounding. The world tilted. His stomach dropped as his feet lost purchase, and he began to drift upward, slow as a dream. Windy was already bracing herself against the galley hatch, face pale with shock. Ivrix, caught mid-step in the corridor outside, let out a yelp as she pinwheeled awkwardly, arms flailing for something to grab. "Is this your idea of a joke, Sable?" Ivrix snapped, but her voice was more frightened than angry. Sable's reply was fractured, words tumbling over each other. "Joke? Not? Error." Theo pushed off the bulkhead and managed to snag a handhold above the galley table. The battered room had become an aquarium. Ration packs, utensils, even Windy's half-disassembled datapad hung suspended around them. Windy gritted her teeth and propelled herself across the room with practiced precision, catching the nearest handrail. "DTC field's gone," she said tersely. "We're running on backup power. Whatever's left after that last surge fried half our systems." Ivrix drifted into view, her hair floating in wild curls around her head like some dark halo. She glared at Windy, then Theo. "Someone want to explain why we're suddenly living in a physics experiment?" Theo tried for calm and failed. His voice trembled despite him. "Sable, status report. What's still operational?" There was a long pause filled only by the soft clink of metal objects colliding in midair. Then Sable answered, its usual dry wit slurred into nonsense. "Operational is a word, gravity not found. Searching, searching. Oxygen levels, blue raspberry, hull integrity, purple." Windy's eyes widened. "That's not good." "No kidding," Ivrix muttered. She drew herself along the wall until she was face to face with Theo. Her bravado had slipped, beneath it was something raw and unguarded. "We need to fix this now, or we're all going to end up with broken necks, or worse." Theo nodded, forcing himself to focus past the surrealism. "Windy, what do you need?" She exhaled shakily, hands gripping the rail so tightly her knuckles whitened. "I need someone on environmental controls with me. I can't recalibrate the DTC compensator solo in 0G. She looked at Ivrix. "You're lighter on your feet, metaphorically speaking." Ivrix gave a shaky grin that didn't reach her eyes. "I always wanted to be an astronaut. Guess I should have been more specific." Theo tried to muster a reassuring smile but felt it falter. "I'll stay here and try to keep Sable coherent, if we lose life support entirely." "Don't say it," Windy cut in sharply. He nodded once, swallowing hard. As Windy and Ivrix maneuvered themselves down the corridor, bouncing from handhold to handhold like ungainly swimmers, Theo floated alone in the galley, surrounded by drifting debris and Sable's disjointed muttering. "This isn't real." The thought came unbidden, sharp as a blade. It can't be. He closed his eyes for a moment, and in the darkness he heard hospital monitors beeping faintly, smelled antiseptic overlaying the metallic tang of the ship's air. But when he opened his eyes again, he was still adrift in the ruined galley of the Starling, clutching a rail as if it could anchor him to reality. Down in engineering, Windy braced herself against an open panel with one boot wedged awkwardly into a corner seam. Her tools floated around her like satellites. She snatched each one as it drifted past, cursing under her breath. Ivrix hovered nearby, holding a flashlight steady with one hand and the emergency toolkit with the other. Her usual sarcasm was muted by concentration and fear. "Talk to me," Windy said, voice taut. "What are Sable's readings on the DTC core?" Ivrix squinted at the flickering diagnostic display. The numbers blurred and danced, half of them replaced by gibberish code or nonsensical phrases. "Banana error. Null gravity." She shook her head. "It's cycling between all systems nominal and singularity imminent. Take your pick." Windy swore softly and jammed a probe into the relay housing. "We've got to re-establish even partial gravity, or we'll never get enough coolant flow to stabilize anything else." Her hands shook. She gripped her wrench tighter. Ivrix floated closer, voice dropping low so only Windy could hear. "You ever get tired of being the only thing holding this heap together?" Windy barked a hollow laugh. "You think I'm holding anything together? I'm just patching leaks as fast as I can find them. She hesitated, then added quietly, I keep thinking if I stop moving, it'll all fall apart for good. Ivrix was silent for a long moment before she replied, softer than Windy had ever heard her. I know what that feels like. Windy glanced up sharply, caught off guard by the vulnerability in Ivrix's tone. Ivrix met her gaze head-on, eyes shadowed but unflinching. You ever wonder why I never talk about what happened before I joined this crew? Windy blinked. I figured you'd tell us if you wanted to. A bitter smile twisted Ivrix's lips. Most people just want stories they can use against you later. She touched her shoulder absently, where old scars twisted beneath her shirt. I learned early that trust is just another way to get hurt. Windy hesitated, then reached out, awkward and zero, to touch Ivrix's arm lightly. We're not most people. Ivrix looked away quickly, but not before Windy saw something fragile flicker across her face. They worked in silence after that, side by side, but no longer quite so isolated. Meanwhile, Theo floated alone in the galley, listening to Sable unravel. Captain, Sable said suddenly, its voice now eerily childlike, did you ever wonder what happens when you fall forever? Do you become gravity, or do you just forget how to land? Theo shivered. He reached for the nearest console and tried to coax Sable back into coherence. Sable, he said firmly, run diagnostics on environmental controls and DTC compensator. Prioritize critical failures. Static hissed through the speakers before Sable replied, running away. Environmental controls, lost in translation. DTC compensator, chasing its own tail. Theo squeezed his eyes shut as another wave of unreality swept over him, the sterile scent of hospital sheets overlaying the metallic tang of shipboard air, voices echoing somewhere beyond his reach. Stay here, he told himself fiercely. Stay present. A crash from down the corridor snapped him back, a toolbox bouncing off a bulkhead in slow motion as Windy swore loudly enough to carry through the comms. Sorry, Ivrix shouted back, sounding winded and shaken. Theo forced himself to focus on their voices, their bickering anchoring him more surely than any handhold. In engineering, Windy finally managed to clamp two frayed cables together with trembling hands. There? She gasped. Try it now. Ivrix tapped at the console. Nothing happened for a long moment. Then a faint hum vibrated through the deck plates as gravity flickered on for half a second before vanishing again. Better than nothing? Ivrix offered weakly. Windy sagged against the wall, sweat beading along her brow despite the chill. We're close, I can feel it. She shot Ivrix a sidelong glance. If we make it out of this alive, drinks are on me. Ivrix flashed a crooked grin. I'll hold you to that. A sudden jolt sent both women tumbling as gravity surged back at quarter strength, just enough for Windy to land awkwardly against a control panel and Ivrix to crash into a storage locker with an undignified yelp. Progress, Windy crowed breathlessly. Up in the galley, Theo felt himself drop abruptly onto the floor as utensils and ration packs rained down around him. He let out a shaky laugh, half relief, half hysteria, as Sable's voice returned in fits and starts. Gravity restored, mostly apologies for any bruising. Captain Ramirez, are you still there? I'm here, Theo replied hoarsely, rubbing his shoulder where a coffee mug had bounced off it. Sable's avatar flickered on a nearby monitor, its digital iris swimming in static. Apologies for earlier incoherence. System integrity remains compromised but recalibrating. Theo exhaled slowly, letting his pulse settle. A moment later, Windy's voice crackled over comms. Partial gravity is back, but we're not out of danger yet. The DTC field is barely stable, and environmental controls are still iffy. She hesitated, a rare note of vulnerability threading her words. We need all hands if we're going to hold things together. On my way, Theo replied, pushing himself upright. They regrouped in engineering, a little battered but upright now that gravity, such as it was, had returned. Windy leaned heavily against a console. Ivrix sat cross-legged atop an equipment crate, gingerly massaging her elbow. Theo arrived last, still brushing crumbs from his hair and trying not to show how much his hands shook. For once, it was Ivrix who broke the silence, not with sarcasm, but something closer to candor. I hate this, she blurted out suddenly, startling even herself. Not just nearly dying every other day, but this feeling that if I let go for even 1 second, I'll disappear. She stared at her hands as if expecting them to vanish before her eyes. Windy nodded slowly. You're not alone in that. Her voice was quiet but steady now, the engineer's mask slipping just enough for Theo to glimpse the fear beneath it. I'm scared too, all the time, that I'll mess up and everyone will pay for it. Theo found himself nodding along, something inside him loosening at their honesty. We're all scared, he admitted quietly, but we're still here, for each other. He glanced at both women in turn, trying to convey what words couldn't quite reach. For a long moment, none of them spoke. The only sound, the low hum of unstable systems and Sable's intermittent murmurs from overhead. All together now, all together. Then Windy straightened and forced a smile. Let's see if we can keep this rust bucket flying another day. They set to work, divvying up repairs and double-checking jury-rigged circuits. The tension remained, but something had shifted. Confessions traded for trust. Fear leavened by solidarity. As they finished their makeshift repairs, gravity still unreliable but holding, the three drifted toward the galley by unspoken agreement. There they found what passed for dinner. Ration bars hacked into uneven pieces. Chapter 5, Echoes. The Starling's corridors had never felt so claustrophobic. Even with gravity stuttering back to a limp semblance of normal, every step Theo took seemed to echo, too loud, ricocheting off thin walls and bouncing around in his skull. The lights overhead flickered between dim orange and sickly blue, making shadows crawl in the corners. Sometimes he thought they moved when he wasn't looking. He pressed his palm against the cool metal of the observation blister's hatch, the one place on the ship where you could see the stars without distortion. It was Windy who'd suggested they hole up here. If pirates are coming, might as well have a good view while we panic, she'd said with her usual dry bravado. But beneath it, Theo had heard the tremor. He drew a slow breath and keyed the hatch open. Inside, Ivrix was already there, curled up on the padded bench beneath the wide viewport. Her legs were drawn to her chest, boots splayed haphazardly, arms wrapped tight as if she could contain her own restlessness. Windy stood at the far end, hands shoved in her pockets, watching the starfield wheel past, if you could call it that, with half the ship's nav sensors still on the fritz. Sable's avatar shimmered on a wall panel, just a single digital iris, ringed with static that pulsed in time with the ship's faltering heartbeat. Theo closed the hatch behind him. Any change? Windy shook her head, jaw set. Signals keep spiking. Sable's picking up intermittent pings. Classic pirate tactics. They want us to panic and do something stupid. Ivrix snorted. Too late for that. Sable's voice filtered through, oddly subdued. External threat assessment. 3 unidentified vessels in local space. Probability of hostile intent, 73%. Suggest minimizing external emissions and preparing for potential boarding scenario. Theo tried to swallow around the knot in his throat. Options? Windy let out a humorless laugh. Hide and hope they get bored. Or try to bluff our way out, assuming any of us can talk straight after the week we've had. Ivrix's eyes flicked up, sharp and gleaming in the gloom. Or maybe someone finally admits they've been skimming supplies and sabotaging our odds all along. She didn't look away from Windy. Windy bristled, squaring her shoulders. You want to say that again? Ivrix unfolded herself from the bench, moving with that loose-limbed grace that always seemed a little dangerous. I'm saying our food stores are lighter than they should be, and I'm missing a whole med kit, again. You're the only one with unrestricted access to storage, Windy. Windy laughed, a short, brittle sound. Oh, that's rich coming from you. You're the quartermaster, Ivrix. If something's missing, maybe you should check your own logs before pointing fingers. Theo stepped between them, palms raised. Enough. We've got bigger problems than ration packs right now. Ivrix jabbed a finger at Windy anyway. She's always got an answer, doesn't she? Always so sure she's right. Like none of us ever make mistakes except me. Windy's lips thinned. You want to talk about mistakes? Let's talk about you promising those scavengers more than we could give last time. Nearly got us spaced for your trouble. Ivrix flinched as if struck, then masked it with a sneer. At least I'm not pretending everything's fine while the ship falls apart. Windy rounded on her. I keep things running because if I stop for 1 second, this whole mess comes apart at the seams. Theo felt his pulse thudding in his ears, too loud, too fast. The room seemed to tilt. For an instant he saw double, 2 Windies glaring at 2 Ivrixes, their voices overlapping in strange harmonies. He blinked hard. The vision snapped back to singularity. He tried to steady his voice. "We're all tired and scared," he said quietly, "but tearing each other apart isn't going to help us survive what's out there." He gestured vaguely at the star-streaked void beyond the glass. Sable's avatar flickered ominously. "Statistical models indicate that internal conflict decreases survival probability by—" "Not now," Theo snapped. Silence fell. A heavy, uncomfortable hush broken only by the soft hiss of the environmental system. Or was it a hospital ventilator? For a moment he couldn't tell. Ivrix sank back onto the bench, rubbing at her eyes with trembling fingers. Windy sagged against the bulkhead, all fight draining from her frame. Theo let himself slide down to sit cross-legged on the deck plates, facing both women. Windy broke first, voice brittle but honest. "I didn't take anything from storage, Ivrix. I swear it." She looked directly at Ivrix, and for once there was no challenge in her gaze, only exhaustion. Ivrix held that gaze for a long moment before sighing raggedly. "Maybe I screwed up my counts," she admitted grudgingly. "Wouldn't be the first time." Windy managed a crooked smile. "We're all running on fumes." Theo nodded slowly. "Let's assume it's just mistakes until we have proof otherwise." He tried to focus on their faces, their real faces, but his vision blurred at the edges again. Windy's hair flickered between short-cropped and long. Ivrix's eyes shifted color, brown to gray to green. He squeezed his eyes shut and pinched the bridge of his nose. When he opened them again, everything was as it should be, except now Windy was watching him with concern. "You okay?" she asked quietly. He wanted to lie, but found he couldn't. "Something's wrong," he managed. "With me." He tried to find words for it, the sense that reality kept skipping like a damaged vid file, that sometimes he heard voices from rooms he'd never seen or smelled antiseptic instead of metal and ozone. Ivrix raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. Windy knelt beside him, close enough that he could feel her warmth even through 2 layers of threadbare jumpsuit. "What do you mean?" she asked softly. Theo swallowed hard. "Sometimes conversations repeat, or people say things twice, but different each time. Sometimes your faces change." He laughed weakly. It sounded more like a sob. "Sometimes I hear alarms that aren't there, or see white walls instead of metal." Windy reached for his hand, hesitated, then took it anyway. "You're not losing it," she said fiercely. "Or if you are, we all are together." Theo squeezed her hand back, hard enough that she winced, but didn't pull away. "I keep thinking," his voice cracked, he forced himself onward anyway, "that I could disappear right here and nobody would notice, that maybe I already have." The words tumbled out before he could stop them. Raw fear laid bare at last. Windy's grip tightened. "That's not true." Her eyes were bright with something fierce and unyielding. "You're here. You're real. To us." She shot a glance at Ivrix for backup. Ivrix looked away first but nodded once, grudgingly. "You're annoying enough to be real," she muttered. Theo barked a surprised laugh and felt something inside him ease for the first time in days. Windy leaned closer until their foreheads nearly touched. Her voice dropped to a whisper meant only for him. "You matter here, even when you don't believe it yourself." A distant alarm began to wail. At first, Theo thought it was another hallucination, but then Sable's avatar pulsed red. "External signals increasing?" Sable intoned flatly. "Recommend immediate lockdown procedures." Theo scrambled upright as Windy and Ivrix did the same. The moment broken but not lost. Windy moved to the control panel by the hatch, fingers flying over the manual overrides as she sealed them in. Ivrix checked her sidearm with shaking hands, then caught Theo watching and managed a smirk. "Just in case our guests want more than polite conversation?" Sable's voice came again. "Life support integrity holding at 82%, hull stress increasing in sectors 4 and 6. Theo found himself staring out at the endless dark beyond the glass, a single ship's lights blinking in the distance, predatory and patient. He heard Windy mutter under her breath, "If we make it out of this alive." Ivrix finished for her. "We're going to need better luck than we've ever had." For a moment, they simply stood together, 3 battered survivors framed by starlight and fear, waiting for whatever came next. Theo felt another ripple of unreality pass through him. For an instant, Windy was dressed in hospital scrubs. Ivrix was gone entirely. Sable's avatar was replaced by a flat line on a heart monitor. He blinked hard, and they were back. Windy biting her lip as she watched the door, Ivrix rolling her shoulders as if preparing for a fight. Sable flickering uncertainly on its panel. Theo drew a breath, steadying himself with their presence, their voices anchoring him once more. "We'll get through this," he said softly, even if he wasn't sure who he meant by we anymore. Windy nodded once, sharp and certain despite everything unraveling around them. "Yeah," she said fiercely, "we will." Outside, somewhere in the void, hostile signals danced closer, but inside the observation blister there was a fragile peace. 3 hearts beating stubbornly against fear and doubt, clinging together against everything pulling them apart. And as another alarm began to sound, a new warning or just another echo, Theo clung to their voices like lifelines spun from hope and desperation alike. End of Chapter 5. Chapter 6, No Secrets in Vacuum. The first warning was a tremor beneath Theo's feet, not the usual shudder of a ship groaning under old wounds, but a sharp, percussive jolt that set every loose tool in the engine bay rattling and sent a splinter of dread slicing through his chest. He'd come down here for quiet, if the throbbing heart of the Starling could ever be called quiet. Windy and Ivrix had retreated to opposite ends of the ship after last night's argument, tension still prickling in the air. Sable's avatar hovered dim on a wall panel, flickering in and out as though uncertain whether to bother with corporeal form. Theo was alone, or as alone as anyone could be on a ship this size, picking at a loose seam in his sleeve and replaying Windy's words from the observation blister. "You're real. To us." He wanted to believe it. He wanted another jolt, this one sharper, accompanied by a metallic shriek that made his teeth ache. Red lights stuttered to life along the bulkhead, and Sable's voice blared overhead, more urgent than he'd ever heard it. "Warning, hull breach detected. Compartment Delta 6, sealing bulkheads. Atmospheric integrity compromised." Theo's stomach dropped. Delta 6 was just aft of engineering, one thin wall away from where he stood. Footsteps pounded down the corridor. Windy burst through the hatch, hair wild, eyes wide and bright with adrenaline. "Did you feel?" Before she could finish, Ivrix slid in behind her, breathless, clutching a battered toolkit to her chest. Sable's voice cut through their confusion. "Captain, all hands are advised to remain in the engine bay. Emergency protocols engaged." "Hull breach is expanding." Theo snapped into motion, moving to seal the hatch behind them even as the air pressure dipped, the tiniest hiss at first, then growing as panels flexed and groaned. Windy spun on her heel, scanning the room. "We need to patch it from here. If we lose Delta 6, we lose the DTC compensator and half our O2 reserves." Ivrix tossed her kit on the deck and started yanking out sealant patches and plasma welders with practiced desperation. "If you've got prayers left, Captain, now's the time." Theo tried to steady his voice. "Sable, status?" Static sizzled in response before Sable's tone returned, brittle and strained. "Breach is localized, but spreading along micro-fissures in starboard plating. Recommend immediate manual intervention. Automated systems are insufficient." Windy was already halfway up the access ladder, wrench between her teeth, muttering calculations under her breath. Ivrix shoved a patch gun into Theo's hands. "You remember how to use this?" Her sarcasm was automatic, but her hands shook as she loaded another canister of foam sealant. He nodded, he hoped convincingly, and followed Windy up toward the maintenance crawlspace that led to Delta 6's inner wall. The corridor beyond was sealed off by Sable's emergency doors. Any hope of outside help was gone. Windy braced herself against a strut and barked orders over her shoulder. "Ivrix, monitor pressure from here. If it drops below 0.5, vent this section and get Sable to reroute life support." Ivrix saluted with 2 fingers, then hunched over the controls, lips pressed tight. Theo caught up with Windy as she pried open an inspection panel. The air was colder here. He could feel it slipping away through seams he couldn't see. She glanced back at him, face smeared with grease and fear. "Ready?" "No," he said honestly, "but let's do it anyway." Windy flashed a crooked grin, her old bravado peeking through. "That's my line." They crawled forward together, knees scraping metal, shoulders pressed close in the narrow chute. The sound of escaping air grew louder with every meter, a banshee wail echoing through steel and bone. At last they reached the breach, a jagged tear running along the seam where 2 ancient hull plates met. Frost feathered outward from the fissure, every breath crystallized in the frigid air. Windy wedged herself sideways and pulled out her welder. "On 3, she said softly. Theo jammed the patch gun against the widest gap and counted under his breath. 1, 2. A sudden vibration made them both freeze, a deeper groan from somewhere below decks. For an instant, Theo saw white walls again, smelled antiseptic overlaying the tang of leaking coolant, but then Windy's voice snapped him back. 3. He squeezed the trigger. Viscous foam spurted into the gap, hissing as it met vacuum-cold metal. Windy followed with a sweep of blue flame, welding the makeshift patch into place. For a moment it seemed to hold. Then another fissure spidered outward, splitting along an old repair weld. Windy swore under her breath. "It's not enough. We need more coverage or we're going to lose this whole section." Theo fumbled for another patch, hands numb with cold and panic. Below them, Ivrix's voice crackled over comms. "Pressure's dropping faster now. 40 seconds before we hit redline." Windy glanced at Theo, something desperate in her eyes. "I can hold it long enough for you to double layer that seam, but if I let go—" She didn't finish. She didn't have to. Theo pressed his palm flat over hers, steadying her hand on the welder as much as himself. "We do this together," he said fiercely. She nodded once, no quip this time, and they worked in frantic tandem. Patch, weld, patch again until their arms shook and sweat froze on their skin. Ivrix's voice came again. 20 seconds? You two better not die before I get my turn to yell at you." A laugh burst out of Theo, half hysteria, half defiance, as he slammed one final patch over the breach. Windy hit it with a pulse of flame. Foam hissed, fused, then held. The whale faded, pressure stabilizing on Sable's readouts. For a long moment nobody moved, just breathing hard in the chill air, waiting for another rupture that didn't come. Then Ivrix whooped over comms. "Pressure holding! You maniacs actually did it!" Windy slumped against the bulkhead, grinning weakly. "I'll take my medal now." Theo managed a shaky smile, but beneath it his hands still trembled. He looked at Windy, really looked at her, and saw exhaustion etched deep around her eyes. "How close were you to giving up?" he asked quietly. She didn't pretend not to understand. She drew a long breath before answering, voice raw as scraped knuckles. "Closer than I ever wanted to admit." She met his gaze head-on. "Last week I almost took an escape pod when things got bad with life support. I had it all planned out." She laughed bitterly. Like that would have helped. Theo felt something inside him twist. Not quite surprise, more like recognition. "Why didn't you?" Windy shrugged helplessly. "You." She shot him a look both fierce and vulnerable. "And Ivrix, and even Sable when it isn't being a pain in my ass." She wiped her sleeve across her mouth. "Didn't want to leave anyone behind, even if I thought I should." Theo nodded slowly, feeling for once that maybe he understood his own stubbornness too. They crawled back toward engineering on legs that barely remembered how to work. Ivrix met them at the hatch with arms crossed and an expression pitched somewhere between relief and irritation. "You idiots nearly got yourselves spaced," she said, but there was no heat in it now. Windy rolled her eyes as she slumped onto a crate. "We're alive. You can yell later." Sable's avatar flickered onto the nearest panel, its digital iris clearer than it had been in days. Hull breach contained, atmospheric integrity restored. It paused, a rare hesitation for the AI before adding, "Statistically improbable, yet here you are." Ivrix snorted laughter, too loud, too sudden, but when she looked at Theo her bravado faltered. Her next words came out in a rush. "Look, I have to say something." She paced once along the length of engineering before stopping dead center, staring at her boots. "I lied about those medkits last week," she said abruptly. "I was scared after Nemean's belt. I thought if I kept something back, just in case, maybe I'd have leverage if things went sideways." Her voice broke on the word sideways. She forced herself onward anyway. "Didn't trust anyone, not even myself." Windy started to speak, but Theo held up a hand. Ivrix looked up at both of them, eyes shining with unshed tears or just exhaustion. It was hard to tell now. "I nearly doomed us because I couldn't let go of being scared." She laughed harshly at herself. "So there it is, my big secret." Silence stretched out, a living thing between them all. Windy was first to move. She crossed the space between them and punched Ivrix lightly on the shoulder. Not hard enough to hurt, just enough to say, "I'm here." "You think you're special?" Windy said gently. "We've all done stupid things out of fear." Ivrix looked at Theo, waiting for judgment or anger or worse, but Theo only shook his head and offered a crooked smile. "If we started keeping score for mistakes made out of fear, He trailed off, letting implication fill the gap. For a moment, all three stood awkwardly, their confessions hanging in the cold, recycled air like frost on glass. Then Wendy cleared her throat and fixed Theo with a look so direct it nearly knocked him back a step. "Your turn." He blinked, caught off guard by how quickly she saw through him. "My turn?" She nodded once, no softness this time, just honest demand. "You've been holding something back since we pulled you out of that cockpit." Ivrix crossed her arms again, but this time it was defensive curiosity rather than anger. Theo hesitated, felt reality slip sideways for an instant. White walls, voices echoing from nowhere, his own reflection doubled in glass. "I don't know if any of this is real," he said finally, voice barely more than a whisper, but ringing clear in engineering's hush. "Sometimes I think, maybe I'm still lying in some hospital bed somewhere." His throat tightened. He pressed on anyway. "But whatever this is, real or not, you matter more than anything I remember outside these walls." Nobody spoke for several heartbeats, the only sound Sable humming quietly through system checks overhead. Wendy stepped closer and rested a calloused hand on his shoulder. Ivrix bumped him with her hip as she passed by to grab another ration pack from storage. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, not yet, but something shifted between them all. Old wounds acknowledged if not healed, secrets aired in vacuum where nothing could hide for long. Sable broke the silence with its usual dry wit. "Crew cohesion has increased by 23% since last confession cycle. Statistically speaking, survival odds have also improved, from negligible to merely improbable." Wendy barked a laugh that was half sob, half relief as she leaned against Theo for support. Ivrix grinned, a small thing but real, as she tossed Theo a ration bar. "Eat up, Captain Lazarus. You're gonna need your strength if we're gonna make it through another day." Theo caught it one-handed and found himself laughing too, a sound brighter than anything he'd felt in weeks. Outside engineering, alarms had faded, lights steadied into something like normalcy. Chapter 7. The center cannot hold. The Starling drifted through the last stretch of black between systems, its battered hull whispering against the silence. In the cockpit, Theo watched the nav display cycle through its final approach vectors, each line of code flickering between clarity and static as if the ship itself was uncertain what was real. Outside, the stars looked smeared and swollen, as though someone had pressed their thumb to the glass of the universe. He felt it in his bones, the promise of a destination, a safe haven, or at least the rumor of one, somewhere in these coordinates, a place Sable claimed might take them in, patch their wounds, and let them breathe. But nothing felt solid anymore. Every panel, every breath, every heartbeat seemed to echo twice. The AI's voice broke the hush, clipped and almost gentle. "Approaching destination. Estimated time to docking, 22 minutes. Shall I prepare a landing protocol, Captain?" Theo's fingers hovered over the controls. "If you think we'll actually make it." Sable's iris shimmered on the display, static crawling at its edges. Probability of successful arrival, fluctuating, parameters undefined. A faint smile tugged at Theo's lips despite himself. "That's comforting." The hatch behind him hissed open. Wendy entered first, her eyes bloodshot but steady, hair matted from too many hours bent over circuitry. Ivrix followed, hands shoved deep in her jacket pockets, her usual swagger dulled by exhaustion. Wendy dropped into the co-pilot seat without preamble. "Sable says we're close?" "Close as we ever get," Theo replied. Ivrix leaned against the bulkhead, studying him with an intensity he tried not to meet. "You sure you want to trust what passes for reality out there?" Her tone was light, but something brittle glinted beneath it. Theo tried for humor, his oldest shield. "I'll trust anything that isn't this floating coffin." Sable interrupted with a dry edge. "Please refrain from disparaging this vessel while still aboard." Wendy snorted. "Don't mind him, he's just anxious." Theo opened his mouth to respond, but the cockpit lights flickered. For an instant, everything doubled. Two Wendys, both with matching frowns, two Vrixes, both arching a brow, Sable's avatar splitting into a kaleidoscope of digital irises. He squeezed his eyes shut, and when he opened them again, all was as it should be. Except Wendy was watching him too closely now. "Are you all right?" she asked quietly. He hesitated. The urge to lie, to say he was fine, felt as thin as the recycled air. "Just tired," he offered instead. Ivrix pushed off the wall, coming to stand beside him. "We're all tired." She sounded almost gentle. The nav display glitched again, coordinates spinning through impossible angles before resolving into a single point of blue-white light, their supposed sanctuary. Time fractured after that. One moment they were running landing checklists, Windy muttering about pressure seals and Sable reciting probabilities in a voice that echoed from too far away, and then Theo blinked and found himself in the common room, ration packs spread across the table in neat rows. Windy's voice came from somewhere behind him. "You can't keep avoiding this conversation, Theo." He turned, and the common room was gone. He stood instead in engineering, Ivric sitting cross-legged atop a crate, her face half-shadowed by flickering emergency lights. "You don't have to carry it all alone," she said softly. He blinked again, and now he was in the galley, Windy leaning across from him, eyes fierce. "Who are you when no one is watching?" she demanded. The question reverberated, echoing down corridors that twisted into hospital-white infinity. For a moment he saw his own reflection doubled in the porthole glass, one version haggard and bruised, the other pale and unmarked, eyes wide with confusion. He reached out, a trembling hand pressed to cool metal, and felt nothing but static beneath his skin. Windy's voice cut through the fog. "Theo? Hey, stay with me!" He jerked upright in the cockpit again, Windy gripping his shoulder so tightly her knuckles blanched. Ivrix hovered nearby, eyes narrowed with worry. "You zoned out," Windy said quietly. "Scared us half to death." Theo licked dry lips. "Sorry, just lost my place for a second." Ivrix crouched at his side, searching his face for something she wouldn't name aloud. "You remember where we are?" He nodded, though he wasn't sure it was true. Sable spoke up, its voice suddenly stripped of all pretense. "Captain Ramirez, your neural activity is deviating from baseline parameters. May I inquire as to your current sense of reality?" Theo laughed, a short, sharp sound that tasted like panic. "You tell me." Sable's iris dilated and contracted in a slow pulse. "I am uncertain whether this state is simulation or recollection. However, you are still here. That is sufficient data for now." Windy shot a look at the display. Not helping Sable, but Sable pressed on. "If you are dreaming, what would you choose to wake for? If you are awake, what would you risk to remain so?" Theo swallowed hard, his hands trembling in his lap. "I don't know," he whispered. Another jump cut. Now he sat across from Ivrix in the darkened observation blister, starlight painting sharp lines across her face. She was speaking, not with her usual sarcasm, but with raw honesty that made him ache. "You're trying so hard to keep us together," she said softly, "but you can't control everything, not even yourself." Her eyes glittered, not tears exactly, but something close. He tried to answer, but his mouth wouldn't move. All he could do was listen as she continued. "You blame yourself for every mistake, for every time I took something I shouldn't have, or Windy nearly gave up. You think if you just try harder, if you're just better, it'll all make sense again." She shook her head slowly. "But pain isn't proof you're alive. It's just proof you care." He blinked, and now Windy was there instead, crouched beside him in the corridor outside engineering. "Let go," she urged gently. "You don't have to fix it all alone." He closed his eyes and heard Sable's voice echoing from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Who are you when no one is watching?" Reality unraveled further, the ship dissolving into white static, corridors stretching into infinity before snapping back into cramped familiarity. He saw flashes, Windy's hand closing over his, Ivrix's laugh twisting into a sob, Sable's iris blinking out like a dying star. In one moment he stood in the engine bay, alarms howling as pressure dropped. In another he lay curled on a hospital bed, machines humming at his side while unfamiliar voices murmured over him. For an endless instant he drifted between worlds, caught between the Starling's failing systems and antiseptic silence. He found himself back in the cockpit as if nothing had happened, as if everything had happened. Windy knelt beside him again. Ivrix stood behind her, arms folded tight across her chest. "You still with us?" Windy asked softly. Theo nodded, but it felt like a lie. Ivrix crouched so they were eye to eye. "Listen to me," she said, her voice fierce and urgent. "You don't have to be perfect or certain or even whole. You just have to be here." She hesitated, then added with a crooked grin, "We've survived on less." Windy squeezed his shoulder. "You matter, whether you believe it or not." A tear slid down Theo's cheek before he could stop it, hot and bitter with relief or grief or both. "I'm scared," he admitted at last, the words small but true. Windy nodded once. "Me too." For a long moment they sat together, the battered crew of a ship that might not exist at all, anchored only by each other's presence. Somewhere outside, Sable announced, "Docking sequence initiated. External environment remains ambiguous." Theo managed a shaky laugh. "Doesn't matter what's out there if we're together in here." Ivrix grinned, a flash of old bravado returning. "That's the spirit." But Windy's expression grew serious again as she leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper meant only for him. "If you go, wherever this takes us, promise me you'll listen for my voice." Theo nodded through tears he couldn't explain. The ship shuddered, a vibration that ran up through the deck plates and into his bones. White light flooded the cockpit. Sable's avatar dissolved into pure static. Windy's hand tightened on his arm as reality itself seemed to buckle and fold inward. And just before everything dissolved into blinding white and silence, he heard Windy's voice, clearer than anything. "You're not invisible here. Not to me." He clung to those words, the only anchor left, as the world fragmented around him once more. Corridors became hospital hallways, ration packs became IV lines. Ivrix's laughter blurred into an unfamiliar woman's sobs. Sable's dry wit faded into the flatline beep of a heart monitor. But always there was Windy's voice, calling him back, holding him together as everything else slipped away. And as white light closed over him, Theo let go, not of hope or pain or memory, but of the need to know what was real. All that mattered now was connection, the fragile thread spun from words spoken in darkness and desperation alike. He reached for it, held fast, and let himself fall forward into whatever waited next. Chapter 8, Awakening. The world came back to Theo all at once, not as a gentle surfacing, but as a sharp, shuddering ascent. He gasped, lungs burning with air that tasted of antiseptic and filtered sunlight, and for a moment he was certain he'd lost everything. The hum of the Starling's engines was gone. The low, sardonic drone of Sable's voice, Windy's laughter, Ivrix's barbed retorts, all had been replaced by a hush so absolute it pressed against his eardrums. He tried to move. Pain lanced up his spine, hot and immediate. His body refused to obey. Panic clawed at his chest. A machine somewhere to his left beeped, a slow, steady rhythm. Felines tugged at the crook of his arm. The sterile scent in the air was thick enough to taste. He was not aboard his ship. He was nowhere at all. Theo blinked hard, vision swimming as the world resolved itself into the washed-out glare of hospital lights. White ceiling tiles, a window half-shaded by a plastic blind, the faintest glimmer of city skyline beyond, blurred by rain. He was in a hospital bed, strapped in by gravity, by tubes, by the finality of waking up. The door opened with a pneumatic sigh. For an instant, Theo's mind supplied the hiss of a ship's hatch, the urgent scuffle of boots on deck plates, but it was only the soft tread of rubber soles on linoleum. A woman entered, short hair bristling with static, eyes ringed with exhaustion and something fierce beneath. Windy she, no, not Windy the engineer, but Winona she, his partner, her face stripped of bravado, her hands trembling where they clutched a paper cup. She hesitated at the threshold as if afraid she might break him by stepping closer. He managed to rasp out a single word, "Windy?" She flinched at the nickname but crossed to his bedside anyway, perching awkwardly on the edge of the plastic chair. "Hey," she said quietly, "you're awake." Theo tried to smile. It felt like a betrayal. "I thought." His voice cracked and failed. Windy leaned in, her hand hovering over his before settling gently atop it. Her palm was warm, solid and real in a way nothing else in this strange new world seemed to be. "You've been out for days," she said. "The doctors weren't sure when, if you'd come back." He swallowed hard, searching her face for some hint of the woman he'd known on the Starling. There was no grease smudge on her cheek, no clipped sarcasm in her tone, only worry and relief and an ache that mirrored his own. "Where am I?" he managed. "Memorial General," she replied softly. "You were in an accident." She squeezed his hand as if grounding herself as much as him. "There was a crash. Ivrix was driving. You took the worst of it, Ivrix." Her name conjured up 1,000 memories. Laughter echoing down steel corridors, arguments over ration packs, her voice sharp with fear or softened by regret. Theo turned his head painfully toward the door, half expecting her to appear in a battered flight jacket, boots thudding against deck plates. Instead, another figure hovered in the doorway, a woman with wild, dark curls pulled back in a messy knot, cheeks hollowed by guilt and sleepless nights. Yvette Vickers, Ivrix without armor. She lingered just outside the room, knuckles white around the strap of her bag. Wendy looked up and nodded once, a silent invitation. Yvette stepped inside, gaze flickering everywhere but Theo's face. She set her bag down with exaggerated care and cleared her throat. "I brought you something," she said awkwardly, pulling out a battered deck of playing cards, the same brand they'd used to pass time aboard the Starling. She placed them on the tray table, pushing them toward him with trembling fingers. Theo stared at the cards, words catching in his throat. Yvette shifted from foot to foot, then blurted, "I'm sorry." The words hung between them like static before a storm. "It was my fault. I shouldn't have been driving. I shouldn't have." Her voice broke. She scrubbed at her eyes with the back of one hand. Wendy stood abruptly and rounded the bed to press her shoulder against Yvette's, a quiet solidarity that needed no explanation. Theo forced himself to speak past the lump in his throat. "You didn't. None of us wanted this." He tried to reach for forgiveness, but his fingers barely twitched beneath the weight of sheets and bandages. Yvette let out a shaky laugh, half sob, half relief. "You always say that." Wendy squeezed Yvette's shoulder before returning to sit beside Theo again. "We're here," she said firmly. "All three of us." For a long moment there was only the sound of machines and rain against glass. The hours blurred together after that. Doctors coming and going in white coats that reminded Theo uneasily of Sable's digital iris, nurses checking vitals with brisk efficiency, orderlies who spoke in gentle tones as they adjusted pillows or straightened IV lines. Each face was both familiar and strange, a constellation of care orbiting Theo's bed. Sometimes Wendy would read aloud from battered novels or news feeds, her voice steady even when her hands shook. Sometimes Yvette would shuffle cards or recount stories from their college days. Wild nights and reckless dares that felt impossibly distant now. But always there was conversation, halting at first, then gaining strength as days passed. Wendy refused to let Theo retreat into silence or despair. When he lapsed into brooding quiet, she would nudge him, gently at first, then with growing insistence. "Don't disappear on me," she said one afternoon, her eyes bright with stubbornness. "Not after everything." Theo tried to muster humor, his oldest shield, but it fell flat. "I'm not much company these days." Wendy snorted softly. "You never were." She leaned closer, lowering her voice so only he could hear. "But you're still here, and that matters." He closed his eyes against sudden tears. Yvette visited every evening, always bringing something small, a crossword puzzle torn from a newspaper, a thermos of real coffee, contraband in the ward, a new pack of playing cards when the old one grew too tattered to shuffle. She never stayed long, guilt making her restless, but each time she left, Theo felt lighter somehow. One night she lingered at his bedside longer than usual, twisting a ring around her finger until Wendy finally took pity and slipped out for coffee. Yvette stared at her hands for a long time before speaking. "I keep thinking if I'd just paid more attention, maybe none of this would have happened." Her voice was raw with regret. Theo reached for her hand, awkwardly at first, then with growing confidence as she met him halfway. "We all make mistakes," he said quietly. "That doesn't mean we stop being family." She gave him a watery smile. "Even after everything?" "Especially after everything." They sat together in silence after that. No need for words as city lights flickered beyond rain-streaked glass. The hospital staff became part of Theo's new world. Nurse Kwan with her dry wit and bottomless stash of hard candies. Dr. Patel, who always explained each test twice, just so you can check my math. Orderly Marcus, who whistled off-key classics as he made his rounds. They became his new crew, each playing their part in this earthbound constellation. One morning, Nurse Kwan caught Theo staring blankly at the ceiling tiles and patted his arm briskly. "If you want sympathy," she said with mock severity, "you'll have to earn it." She pressed a butterscotch candy into his palm before bustling away. Theo smiled for the first time that day. Physical therapy was slow, painful in ways he hadn't expected, but Wendy was relentless as ever, cajoling him through exercises, cracking jokes about gravity failing, try not to float off the treadmill this time, refusing to let him quit even when frustration threatened to swallow him whole. "You survived worse," she reminded him one afternoon as he struggled through yet another set of stretches. He shot her a glare that lacked heat. "Says you." She grinned, sharp-edged but genuine. "You're not invisible here. Not to me." The words anchored him more surely than any harness or brace could have done. As weeks passed and sensation crept slowly back into Theo's legs, reality settled into its new shape. Smaller than life aboard the Starling, perhaps, but warmer for its limitations. He learned how to ask for help without shame, how to accept kindness without suspicion, how to forgive himself for needing both. Still, some nights he lay awake listening to rain drum against glass, longing for the hum of engines and Sable's dry commentary, for Windy's laughter echoing down steel corridors, for Ivrix's sarcasm masking brittle hope. But each time despair threatened to drag him under, Windy would appear at his side, a mug of tea in one hand, determination in her eyes. "We're still here," she'd say simply. "Still talking." And that was enough, for now. One evening, as dusk bled lavender across the horizon, Yvette arrived late, her eyes red-rimmed but clear. She sat on the edge of Theo's bed without preamble and handed him an envelope thick with handwritten pages. "I've been writing it all down," she said softly. "Everything I remember, from before, from after, from what I think I saw while you were out." She hesitated before adding, "I don't know what's real anymore. Not always, but I know what matters." Theo thumbed through the pages. Memories scrawled in looping script, apologies and confessions woven between mundane details, the way you always hum when you're nervous, the way Windy makes terrible coffee on purpose. He looked up at Yvette, saw hope flicker behind old guilt, and nodded once. "Thank you," he whispered. She smiled, a small thing but real, and for the first time since waking, Theo felt something like peace settle over him. The next morning, Dr. Patel pronounced him ready for discharge. Not fully healed. That will take time and patience, but well enough to leave behind antiseptic walls and beeping monitors for the uncertain freedom beyond. Windy helped him dress, her hands gentle as she fastened buttons and tied laces with practiced ease. "You scared me," she admitted quietly as she guided him into a wheelchair by the window. "I thought I'd lost you. For good this time." Theo caught her hand, held it tight as if afraid she might vanish if he let go. "You never lost me," he said softly. "I just got stuck somewhere else for a while." She crouched so they were eye level, her gaze fierce through unshed tears. "If you ever go again," she whispered, "take me with you." He laughed, a bright sound that surprised them both, and squeezed her hand harder still. "Deal." As they waited for paperwork and prescriptions and final instructions from Nurse Kwan, "Don't try any zero acrobatics on my watch," Yvette appeared in the doorway once more, this time with coffee for all three of them, and a shy grin that held no trace of old fear. They sat together beneath flickering fluorescent lights, talking about nothing and everything, favorite movies, worst cafeteria meals, dreams both remembered and half forgotten. Conversation became survival again, a fragile thread spun from hope and forgiveness alike. When at last they wheeled Theo toward the exit, a slow procession marked by laughter and awkward goodbyes, Windy leaned close and murmured,